Where were you on the morning of 9/11? We all remember. That moment in time is sealed in our hearts and our minds forever. Our guest today was at the Pentagon. But in that moment of commanding the crisis, she had to figure out how to effectively communicate with her team. She's a 22-year retired lieutenant colonel in the U.S. Air Force. She has lived around the world and commanded crises ranging from 9/11 to helicopters going down to plane crashes and everything in between. Angela is a communications and PR expert who has lived these experiences and built out a formula and a template to be able to effectively and intentionally communicate in a timely manner in these moments. She has crafted these stories and these experiences into case studies and life lessons that can be applied to not just your personal life, but your professional life as well. Think about those companies that have effectively communicated their own crisis. We have tons of experiences learning what to do and certainly what not to do. Communication is key, especially in those pivots in our lives. Get your pen and paper because you're going to learn some incredible lessons from our guest today about effective communication while commanding the crisis with Angela Billings. On today's episode of the GSD Factor podcast, I'm honored to have Angela Billings. Hi, Angela. How are you?
I'm wonderful, Misha. I just launched a book last night, and it is a number one news release in my category.
Congratulations. Oh, that's amazing. So much to celebrate. I'm excited for our listeners to hear from you, hear your background, and hear some amazing stories from you. You are an amazing storyteller. And we're definitely going to dive into your book, Commanding the Crisis, which it talks about navigating chaos with that battle-tested public relations and communication strategies. But first of all, kudos to you for hitting that bestseller. But Angela, tell our listeners a little bit about you.
Sure, Misha. And thank you for having me on because this is truly extraordinary. We've been wanting to do this for a little while. And I think the timing was, divine intervention since we had to reschedule for an earlier day. That was the day after I launched Command the Crisis. So I am a 22-year Air Force veteran, public affairs officer. I'm originally from Bardstown, Kentucky, small town. In fact, it was voted Rand McNally's number one small town in America a couple of years ago. And I joined the Air Force and was able to travel the world. And whether you view it as fortunately or unfortunately, the role that I played was public affairs officer. So it is part of my job to talk with the media, to set up interviews with our extraordinary airmen, to talk about the missions that we have, those that we pursue just around the globe. And so I moved around with the Air Force for over 2 decades, and was able to use my God-given talents, which originally I was going to be a business major until I flunked pre-calculus. So it just goes to show, use the talents God has given you, and it's all going to turn out wonderfully.
What I love about your story is your years of service. So first of all, thank you for your years of service. And, I come from a military family myself, Air Force specifically.
Yes.
And so the first time that I heard one of your incredible stories, it was, it really rang home for me. And I want you to start off by sharing your Pentagon story.
Sure, Misha. And I thank you for that. And it's, I think timing is everything. And there's a reason that I was there then, and there's a reason that I'm here today. And it was, I just married Greg, my husband, the year before, and we'd moved to the Pentagon. We'd been there about 5 weeks. And I had taken this job that I had really been looking forward to having for the first decade of my years of service. I wanted to be at the Pentagon where national defense policy is created, right, a throw across the Potomac River in our national seat of government. And I wanted to be right in the thick of it all. So as I made my way into the Pentagon that morning, I noticed how the steps in front of me had been worn down by just years of people trudging up those stone steps, going into the building to do their government job. But my perspective was a little bit different. I literally skipped up those steps like a schoolgirl. I was just giddy with excitement because I had my first interview scheduled with a general officer that I'd prepared on our space operations, and I was just beyond excited. So we had our morning spin up meeting, like we did every day, where we talk about what's in the news, what interviews we have scheduled, so that we all kind of know what the other one's doing. And it was just before 9 a.m. when reports from the media indicated that a plane had flown into one of the towers in New York City. And I had already been, in my role in Alaska, I'd already had to work, unfortunately, an airplane crash. And so my mind immediately started going through, well, what kind of plane was it? Who was on board? Knowing the sheer number of planes that fly in the New York skies, I thought, well, I suppose this is possible. It must have been some sort of medical emergency, had to have been a biplane that veered off their flight path. And no one really knew initially. Those initial reports are always really, really sketchy. So some were saying, well, what kind of plane was it? It was a commercial plane. And we were all watching those initial images that were just unbelievable, truly unbelievable. And I'm sure that many of your listeners remember precisely where they were when that plane crashed into the towers. And then I had walked up to the front of the press desk where we have all the television stations monitoring the news, and was watching in horror and disbelief as that second plane flew into the second tower. And I was beyond shock and disbelief about it. And a friend of mine, Mike, who's, his desk was right there next to the bank of television stations, said, Angela, people say we could be a target here. And I paused for just a moment to consider that, went back to my desk, and I had a phone call from that reporter asking, hey, Angela, given what's going on in New York, is this interview still going to happen in DC? And I said, well, I don't know, Ron, but I tell you, I'll call the general's office and I'll call you right back. And no sooner than I had laid the phone in the cradle, than that third plane hit the Pentagon. And all 6.5 million square feet shifted from left to right with that impact. And it felt like a missile into the building. And I recall hearing the retro metal blinds clanking against the windowsill, and seeing that as I ducked underneath my desk for safety. I had no idea where the point of impact was. And I was shocked already. And being the new girl on the press desk, I could hardly figure out how to get to the bathroom and back to my office without losing my way. The building is huge. So a few moments went by and I emerged from under my desk, and Teresa, a reservist who was situated just across the aisle from me, literally grabbed my hand and said, we don't want to go to the inner courtyard. We want to go to the outside of the building. And so she and I and 28,000 people who work in the Pentagon began spilling out of the nearest exit. And it was eerily quiet as we made our way out of the building. The river entrance is what we called it. And usually there's traffic just buzzing by on I-395, but it was silent because everything stopped. And then I heard the distinct sound of helicopter blades chopping through the air. And I ducked again, thinking, oh, this is the second wave. They're going to get the rest of us on the way out of the building. Because I believe everyone in the building that day and around the world knew that this was an attack on America. So our military training kind of kicked in, and we thought, well, we have to go into crisis mode, and we've got a plan for 24-hour operations. What are we going to say? What are we going to do in response to this? And so Teresa and I were volunteered to go home and plan to come back and work the night shift. Any attempt to make a phone call to a loved one from my new Razor phone that I had at the time, all the satellite feeds were jammed. Nobody could call anyone. We had no comms, which is critical in a crisis. Being able to communicate with your team internally as well as externally, it's critical. And as it turned out, there was little said initially. From that point, our president, George W. Bush, was moved from that elementary school in Sarasota, Florida, to Offutt Air Force Base, where he made a statement. And then it was radio silence for quite some time until our national command authority could decide how America was going to respond and then what we would say about it. So while media called and they wanted information, they were demanding information, we were limited initially and really had to refer all the queries to the Department of Defense, and they in turn were referring queries up to the White House.
Angela, what a moving story. I got goosebumps as you were sharing. I think so many of us remember that morning. And the piece of the story that really has stuck with me ever since I first heard you speak it was when you talked about walking up those steps and there at the Pentagon, because my own grandfather and my cousin, who have both been Air Force generals, have walked those steps. And where I would love our conversation to go is, as you are commanding that crisis and figuring out in those moments, I would imagine that as we think about those GSD factor attributes of being confident and inquisitive and imaginative and being present, resilient, and influential, I would imagine that two that really kind of bubble up to the top in those crisis moments, and we'll hear more stories from you here as the podcast goes on, would be that resilient and be present.
Absolutely. And I think that number one is being resilient. So there's much you can do before a crisis happens to anticipate and to plan for those things when stuff happens and you have to respond. And I think that especially in today's society, and I'm going to go out on a limb here, but that's kind of how I live my life, is there's a lot of people who want to play the victim. And I have refused to do that. It's a choice. And that's something that you have incorporated into your platform. It is a choice to persevere and to rise above and to face whatever crisis presents itself to you with a clear mind and being present in that moment to recognize, okay, there's something that requires my attention. I had, 17 other things planned to do today, but now this crisis has presented itself and I've got to shift. And I have to give my focus and my attention to the crisis at hand. And so as a professional communicator and as business leaders, we need to be able to communicate effectively internally into our organization so that we can recognize when we have a crisis that requires a shift, and to talk through that with the rest of your leadership team, your, a kind of a crisis response team. You got your president or your CEO. You might have a chief of your human resources. You've got your office manager or your COO, depending upon how large your organization might be, along with maybe an attorney. And I love attorneys. I love to talk to attorneys and convince them that there are words that I can use to say, even though they don't want to. That's often a test of my resilience. But communicating directly and effectively to those around you so that you bring them into the crisis with you, and staying engaged and having access to that leadership team so that you've already established yourself as the communication expert in your organization, and having access and having developed those relationships so that you can come into that crisis and say, look, we've got to pause and we need to redirect to what is presenting itself on social media, or if you're a manufacturing company and you've had an accident on site, you need to really take a look at What happened? What's the process? Did we adhere to our safety standards? And what are we going to say, if anything, depending upon the magnitude of that, about that? And I will even, I'm kind of tossing a lot out here at you, Misha, but I often think that there are times when brands actually weather a storm, weather a business crisis, and come out on the back end a better brand than they were before because they were open to the conversation. They were open to communicating about what their process or procedure was and be willing to be flexible and adjust to it so that they are a better brand in the process.
What I love about what you're talking about, especially because we have so many entrepreneurs that listen in to our podcast,
Yes,
is communication is key. Pivots are inevitable.
absolutely.
Shifts, right? Shifts are inevitable. Crises are going to happen. Something's going to happen. And there's two paths. There's the let me turtle and not say anything,
Mhm.
or let me effectively communicate. And that's what I love about you and your story and your book and what, the services that you provide is helping those organizations or government bodies figure out what is that right message, what should be communicated, how should it be communicated. And you're absolutely right. You can weather most things if there's effective and intentional communication. And I think that that is something that we have great examples throughout history of moments that were effectively communicated and moments that were not so effectively communicated.
Absolutely, Misha. And it's, you talk about you get a choice of whether how you respond and what you say. And in my book, in Command the Crisis, I do have a crisis decision matrix where I kind of lay out there. Let's take a step back to our natural instincts, that our predecessors, you can either, when you're faced with a threat, you can either fight or flight. You can stay and fight, or you can flee the situation. And in business, you don't often have the opportunity to just check out and head the other direction. You need to face it head on and take a very deliberate, very measured approach to communicating about a crisis that may be presenting itself in your business with intentional conversations and decisive actions, and then stand behind it and be able to articulate that. And I will also offer that the leadership team, sometimes it's the CEO that needs to be the spokesperson, but maybe sometimes it's not. It's someone else, the subject matter expert in a given situation, where your number two guy or your number three woman is actually the one who really can speak with greater authority, with greater command of a particular situation, given what it might be.
It also could be the tone that that person presents, because we hear this phrase a lot, was it tone appropriate? Was it tone deaf? And I think depending on the crisis that at hand, not just the intentional communication is so important, but the timing is important, but also who is delivering that message is just as equally important, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. And in my experience, when there is a significant event, like in my case, an airplane crash, our standard for success is to release some information. It might be one or two lines, but to release information within 1 hour of an incident happening, because that goes to your transparency as a business, as an entity. In my case, it was the Air Force. But even if it was a one or a two-line news release, that has always been the barometer by which we measure success or failure. And of course, a one line, there has been an airplane crash, an investigation will take place. Absolutely, that leads to more questions. And so being able to continue to have those conversations internally, to go to those subject matter experts who can help you ferret out what really did happen and what really didn't, so that you can present the facts to the public, that's critical.
So you have two other amazing stories that I'd love for you to share with our listeners, because I think it speaks to your amazing resilience and your being present, but I also feel like they are such great real life examples of how you managed those crises in those moments?
Sure, Misha, and I have more than two, I'll tell you, but I have two that we'll talk about today. We can talk about the other ones another time. But I was in Alaska. I had just been there about a little more than a year as the wing public affairs officer, and we were pretty busy. We had 5 different flying wings, which not every Air Force installation has that many. They might have like 2, maybe 3, but we had 5, and so we were busy. We had airplanes coming and going all the time, and it was a clear day, and it was my second year there, and I had just come out of a long, hard winter of long hours, keeping my team motivated, and handling the weekly newspaper, handling the myriad press calls that we received, and so it was my first day of vacation. And I had a friend of mine who was coming up from the lower 48. That's what we call the contiguous United States when you're in Alaska, by the way. She'd come up so that we could go camping and hiking and kayaking and kind of, for me, just step away from the day-to-day operational grind and let's get back to nature. Let's, figure out how to, make an oar work for you and use those legs to get up that mountain. So I was really looking forward to this week off. And so it was a Sunday. I went to church, I went to the gym, and my friend was arriving that evening. And so I was kind of waiting around to go to the airport when I get a call from the command post at Elmendorf Air Force Base, which is now Joint Base Elmendorf Richardson. And they said, there's a plane gone down, you need to come in. So I immediately took my recall sheet and called my number 2, and they in turn called the others who made up our public affairs team. There were 10 of us there. And so we all reported for duty. I went into the command post, and there were people swarming around. And I mean, typically you've got, a handful, there's, 5, 6, 8 people. The place was packed. There was the HR, the personnel person was there, the chaplain was there, the operational wing commander was there. And I learned shortly upon my arrival that our 3-star general, Lieutenant General David McLeod, had crashed his personal Yak 54 airplane in Alaska and had perished in the crash. And it was one of those, disbelieving moments where you kind of repeat the words that are told you so that it registers in your mind. Okay, this has happened. We need to respond. And when I took this role up in Alaska, I was fortunate to work with Jerry Brown, a mentor who was the 3-star general's public affairs officer. And then I worked for the 1-star general who worked for the Lieutenant General McLeod. So he and I already had a very good working relationship. And so together, Jerry and I crafted a news release. Again, it was a very simple, 2-line, there's been a crash, and more details will be forthcoming, and there'll be an investigation. So he and I wrote that initial news release, then we proofed it. We did it old-fashioned way. We printed out on a sheet of paper, caught a little typo, so that was good that we did that, and then made the release, which subsequently met additional questions and queries and, well, why and what kind of plane, and then that information we released as we could verify those facts. And in this particular case, everyone knew General McLeod. He had been at the Alaskan Command for I think a number of years at that point when I arrived, and was a revered leader. And it really kind of hit home that we never know when our number's up. And when you know the individual who's involved, you kind of have to check your emotions and step out of that and stay in your role. Even though my heart was grieving for him, for his family, and all of his friends that would miss him, but I also had to stay present in that moment in order to get the facts out and handle that crisis.
I think what is so amazing to me is in those moments, you have to compartmentalize
Absolutely.
and you have to think, okay, in this moment, I need to focus on this. I'll come back to that for you in that moment. You had to effectively and timely communicate, but you needed to grieve at some point, but not in that moment. I think that is, one of the things when you are being present is there is a time and a place for everything, but
Yes.
there's a time and a place for everything, and making sure that we are channeling those right emotions in that right moment, because it could be our role, could be our job, whatever it is. We've got to be sure that we're being what we need to be. We're operating as we need to operate in that moment.
Absolutely. And in this case, I couldn't grieve wholeheartedly initially. I recall the next day stopping by a person who knew General McLeod fairly well. And then the tears kind of started flowing. And so I kind of held it together for the first, I think, 36 hours or so, 48 hours or so. And then it's like, oh, I'm in a safe space. I know this individual. I feel like I can like let my guard down and allow those tears to flow. And then, okay, I've had my little cry, and now I need to get back into it and go back to work.
Ever the storyteller. So let's share this last story for today, because you
Okay.
have some amazing stories, and I know that you share them in your book. And we definitely encourage all of our listeners to go out to Amazon and get Command the Crisis. But share with us this final story, and talk to us about, in those moments, how you had to be resilient and how you had to be present and how you really truly had to activate all of these traits throughout your career.
Absolutely, Misha. In 2006 and 2007, I deployed to Afghanistan in order to participate for the American forces. It was Operation Enduring Freedom. I was deployed from Germany as a NATO asset. So deployed with the International Security Assistance Force, or ISAF. And at first, I was the media operations chief and led the team in that operations cell. And then the latter part of my deployment, I stepped in as the spokesperson. So we did weekly press briefs in order to talk about how we were helping the Afghans provide for their, safety and security. And so this was kind of closer to the tail end of my time in Afghanistan when we received word that a chopper had gone down in the south of Helmand province. And this happened late in the evening after, we had gone to chow, as we say in the military, and most of the team had gone back to their bunker, their Connex boxes, their rack, as we say. And so it was just two of us were on duty. Actually, three of us were on duty, two in the media ops cell and one in the command post, because we always kept a media person in the command post. And so when we got word that a chopper had gone down, the Taliban immediately said, well, we shot it down. And I was like, maybe you did, maybe you didn't. That really wasn't germane at that point. What was important was to get the facts and, get that release out within 1 hour. So the Belgian officer I was working with in the ops cell, we started liaising with our contact in the command post and started to gather that initial information. And so we crafted that two-sentence news release. A chopper has gone down in the south of Helmand province, and there'll be an investigation. And we got that out. We busted the hour, but only by a little, which is a testament to refined processes and taking it seriously when something happens. So we put that initial release out, and of course, the phone just started ringing off the hook. Every media member from every international organization wanted more information. What kind of chopper, who was on board, were there survivors? And all of this is information that, those initial reports are not always clear and accurate. And so you have to allow some time in order to verify that level of detail. And so it became apparent that there were no survivors. And even though the press wanted to know, well, what country were they from? As a NATO spokesperson, that was not important to me or us. We lost the crew. We lost wonderful service members, and the country of origin was not important. And so I had to refer media to the embassies you would like to know information about different countries, you have to go to the embassies. And they're like, well, hey, there's 32 different countries. Are we supposed to call every single one? I'm like, well, that's up to you to decide. I'm telling you that we know that there were no survivors and we are continuing to gather information. And so this went on for days, actually almost a whole week before we knew the country of origin that the embassies then released, because they had to make a notification of the next of kin in each of those instances. And it was a multinational crew. And in this particular case, one young man, a Canadian, was part of the communications team. He was a photographer in our public affairs shop. And it was especially challenging in my position, where I am trying to offer compassion to the public affairs team in the South, while managing up to my higher headquarters in Belgium, who was demanding information. And so I was serving as that go-between for that demand for information and the compassion for people who lost a team member that they had gotten to know and love and trust and worked right alongside. And that is probably one of the more difficult situations I've ever been in, as I toggle between those two roles and try to, in that crisis moment, maintain my resilience and my composure and remain present and being able to articulate to the team in the South, I feel for you. I truly do. I encourage you to seek out a faith representative to talk through your grief that is very real and you are feeling, and do that. And I also need to verify this information. And so when you can, please provide that to me so that I can then answer higher headquarters questions.
So many amazing nuggets and lessons that you have laid out for us, whether it's choosing that effective communication, choosing the right spokesperson, whether it is, deciding when to communicate, when not to communicate. And so many of these things can be applied in businesses. And I think so many times, to your earlier point, we've seen organizations that have done this well and have survived and thrived. And we have seen organizations that have not done this well. And my hope is that for our listeners today, through hearing your stories and reading your book, that they will know that whenever they are facing that crisis, that they need to communicate effectively, they need to pivot and they need to shift. But there's a mode and a process that needs to happen. And it does need to be very methodical and does need to be thought out.
Absolutely. And I offer some very practical checklists in my book, things you can do ahead of a crisis taking place, when you're in the middle of it and you need to set up a press conference in order to say what is taking place. And you also mentioned businesses that have done it well and those that have done it poorly. And I also have taken the tactic of doing a few case studies throughout Command the Crisis, where I look at, and through my lens, how an entity did well or perhaps did not do so well. I mean, the tampering of the Tylenol so many years ago, where people, they died, and Tylenol took that very, very seriously and said, we're not only going to stop selling it, we're going to recall it at a significant cost to us as a business. But they survived and they became a better brand and are still a leader in their category. And then you have other instances, Deepwater Horizon oil spill, that was not handled so well. And 11 people perished in that catastrophic tragedy. And it took them months to stop that oil spill. And it just seemed to me that there could have been a greater sense of urgency, even though there was an apology, and condolences, you got to stop the oil. So definitely opportunities present themselves in the form of a crisis, and being able to anticipate when bad things would happen and mitigate those risks is key to an effective business, and taking that seriously before a crisis presents itself And then once it does, embracing that moment, stepping into that moment and saying, okay, this is what we're going to do, and this is what we're going to say, be decisive and deliberate about it, and command that crisis.
Amazing, Angela. Thank you so much for all of these lessons and these tidbits and the case studies and the examples and these checklists. I think that we all experience these moments in our lives where we need these tools. Finally, my last question for you is, what are you powerfully choosing in 2024?
Oh, wow. That's a great question. I believe that I am being very intentional with how I am spending my time and my energy, both physical and mental, in 2024. I have a wonderful team in the Kentucky Senate where I have a very unique opportunity to articulate the legislative policies that we are putting out in from the General Assembly in Kentucky. This book is another avenue, a project that I had started before I started working with the Senate and had to work on in a part-time capacity. But being able to now launch this and share my experiences with those I think who can benefit from it and from what I have learned and mistakes that I've made too. And then kind of the third pillar of that is I take time to attend church with my family on the weekends, and I have an amazing Bible study on Wednesday evening of some extraordinary women who are viragos, just like me. A virago is a brave or heroic woman. And so we named our Bible study Viragos and Psalms because we're in Psalms right now. And that has been a point of uplift for me where I intentionally carve out that time because I know that my soul needs it so that I can then be more resilient and more present when a crisis presents itself.
Angela, thank you so much. It's been such an honor to have you. I'm so glad that our paths crossed with the NSA and our Kentucky chapter. But thank you so much. And for our podcast listeners today, we hope you've enjoyed today's episode, hearing Angela's amazing stories. And we will share all your connecting information and the book link in our show notes. Thank you, Angela, again. And thank you to our listeners. And don't forget to get shit done.
Thanks for listening to the GSD Factor podcast. If you liked this episode, please rate and subscribe on your favorite podcast platform, where you can also find previous episodes. Let's also connect on LinkedIn and Instagram. If you're looking for more information on the GSD Factor, visit us at gsdfactor.com. And always remember to GSD, get shit done.